the fundamental understanding in BRICS, from what I can see, uh, is flawed because free trade, it seems to me, is fundamentally opposed to a socialist vision of the world. I would say that the alternative to an export-led strategy would be an agriculture-led strategy.
Successes and failures of the communist movement in India.
But the communist movement has been remarkably tough railway strikes.
1974
Yeah,
railway
not
strike.
even talking about 74.
It was 73 loco
Yeah,
strike,
exactly.
68
Loco,
generals.
leading up to it, and Locoman strike was fantastically effective, led by the communists. So you had this big China remains an open question. What is in China is building socialism. Because China's economic success are not talking about. But China, to what extent it is moving to a socialist society, remains an open question. Defeating neo-fascism must mean overcoming the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. That conjuncture is one of neoliberalism at a dead end. Okay. Therefore,
Hey YouTube, this is your host Jyotish Man. Welcome to India and Global Left. For the last 2 years, you have been such a support and it has helped us grow our channel. I'm sure you would continue to do that. I don't have to remind you, but I would still do it. Please, if you are new to our channel, please smash that subscribe button. In either case, do hit like, share, and do comment on our videos. We do read all of them. All right, Professor Patnaik, so nice to meet you.
thank you.
Let's go and do our interview.
Professor Patnaik, welcome back to India and Global Left. I want to start with the recent discussions in BRICS about de-dollarization. We would come to some of the things you have written about the discussions in BRICS. But if we could start with what does the dollarized economy mean for majority of the global south, but also for the global economy in general?
You know, there is an impression that dollar as a reserve currency or a currency of which plays a major role in medium of circulation in world trade is something which is for convenience. That you require some kind of, like in national transactions, you require the local currency. In international transactions, similarly, you require some currency and the dollar is that currency. But that's a misleading understanding because dollar hegemony implies, in fact, an imperialist hegemony. There are two ways in which the role of the dollar really impinges on the power relations among countries. One is that within the global south, it discourages trade or relations between them because of the fact that, look, if I am India and I wish to trade with you who are Sri Lanka, let us say, in that case I have to first get hold of dollars. So the fact that the dollar is the medium of circulation in global exchange is something which actually comes in the way of South-South trade, South-South exchanges. We could, for instance, simply exchange in our local currencies and build up, kind of claims upon one another to be settled later. But that is something which does not happen because each country must first earn dollars before it can exchange in trade. So it is something which prevents South-South cooperation. On the other hand, it also entails a significant power for the leading country of the world, because if dollar is treated by the world to be as good as gold, then that basically means that the US is sitting on a free gold mine. Whether it makes dollars available to somebody or it does not makes a big difference to the recipient. Likewise, the US can print dollars and take over enterprises in the rest of the world. So really, in effect, it is sitting on an unlimited free gold mine. So it gives the US immense power. And of course, by implication, the advanced capitalist countries immense power, but of course, essentially to the US. And at the same time, it breaks up the global south. It kind of, atomizes the global south. So it is really a relationship of power. So the dollar hegemony is not just something which is facilitating global trade, but it is enforcing a certain power relationship in the world economy.
There are. I want to understand what would be a de-dollarized global economy look like. We can talk about finance a little bit later, but just to stick with trade at first, are you thinking about bilateral trade in some kind of national accounting, or are we thinking about an alternative global currency? What is that post-dollar vision in terms of trading?
I would be in favor of bilateral or multilateral trading arrangements where national currencies are really treated as a medium of circulation. Let us say India and Sri Lanka or India and Bangladesh have a multilateral trade arrangement where the currency values of each are fixed in terms of the others, and they trade and they build up claims against one another, and these claims are then settled over a period of time. But that rather than simply having another currency replace the dollar, because to the extent that I was arguing that the dollar itself, dollar hegemony is actually the hegemony of US imperialism, replacing it by another currency would entail bringing in the hegemony of that particular country. So it's not a question of replacing one hegemony by another hegemony, but actually doing away with hegemony altogether. And for that, I would see a better bilateral and multilateral trade arrangement.
Can you tell us a little bit about the financial and even fiscal implications of a dollarized economy? You have written a little bit about the sanctions, and we are seeing that being played out in Russia. Earlier, the Middle East is in the news. There are multiple reports now that even prior to the Iraq invasion in 2003, more than a decade of sanctions after 1991 had crippled the Iraqi economy. We have seen that with the weakening of Assad's government recently, with Syria and so on and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about the position of the imperial nations insofar as its ability to sanction? Do you see a moving away from the dollarized global imperial order because of the sanctions?
I think the immediate provocation for the de-dollarization attempt is the imposition of sanctions. You see, the imposition of sanctions works in two quite different ways. One is that, that since you require dollars to engage in world trade, if your flow of dollars is cut, in that case, your trade possibilities are restricted. You can't kind of, then bypass it by having bilateral trade agreement because you haven't had them to start with. Therefore, the imposition of sanctions is something which actually cuts you off from world money and therefore prevents world trade, prevents your engagement in world trade. And the second, which is really quite powerful, is the fact that countries hold their reserves, foreign currency reserves, in terms of dollars, because the dollar is supposed to be as good as gold. Everybody has confidence in the value of the dollar. And as a result, they hold their currencies, they hold their reserves in the form of dollars, and typically in Western banks. But that gives the US and the Western powers enormous leverage because they can simply impound these dollars. Now, that's completely against any international trade and payments ethics. And that's completely against capitalist ethics. Because after all, capitalism,
Free market.
you have contracts. One contract, you put your money in a bank, and when you take it out, you take it out. But you put your money in a bank, and the bank doesn't allow you to take it out, then that's against the capitalist ethic. But that is something which actually has now become well established. Almost a third of the countries of the world have faced one form or another.
Sovereignty crisis.
Yeah, no.
Balance of payment.
They have faced sanctions.
Sanctions.
And within these, very substantial impounding of foreign exchange reserves has occurred vis-à-vis Iran. It began with the massive impounding of Iran reserves vis-à-vis North Korea, vis-à-vis Cuba, and of course the latest in Russia. So the impounding of reserves basically is an extremely, in capitalist terms, unethical arrangement, but it's an arrangement of power.
I think this is a nice segue to talk a little bit about your broader, I wouldn't say critique, but the idea that some of the discussions in the BRICS are inadequate given the talks have remained within the fold of making WTO in terms of trade more inclusive for the nations, and in terms of finance, the IMFs and the World Bank, the Bretton twin institutions, more inclusive. Can you elaborate a little bit about what your thoughts were on this regard? Since you mentioned the imbalances lead to the blackmailing of countries.
Yes. No, I think the fundamental understanding in BRICS, from what I can see, is flawed because they see the problem of the world economy, the unequal nature of the world economy in terms of the fact that the third world countries are not properly represented in some of these organizations. But I don't think that is the real problem. I think the real problem is that, is the fact that in the case of trade imbalances, it is the deficit countries that are forced to make adjustments. The surplus countries are not. I think when the Bretton Woods...
Just for our viewers, by surplus countries, you mean those who export more than they...
That's right, yes. Exactly. When the Bretton Woods system was started, there was a suggestion that actually the surplus countries should be made to make adjustments. But this was turned down because the United States those days were a surplus country, and therefore it didn't want to make adjustments. But you see, you can immediately see how the surplus countries making adjustments is in fact beneficial for the world economy as a whole. Because suppose it is the case that you have, let us say, Germany having a surplus vis-à-vis Greece. Now, if Germany is asked to make adjustments, German economy would more or less closer to full capacity, full employment, because it's an export success story. Then Germany could actually be asked to increase its internal consumption. German workers could be consuming more. On the other hand, that would mean that when Greece does not get German goods, which are now consumed by German workers, in Greece the output would increase because a lot of the Greek output was not materializing because it was being outcompeted by German goods. But if German goods don't come into Greece, then Greece output expands employment. So world employment expands, world output expands, world consumption expands. But you look at the situation as it currently exists, what happens is that, the deficit country is made to adjust, which means it reduces its level of demand, it reduces its consumption and so on, which basically means that world output and employment actually shrinks compared to what it was to start with.
I want to move on, but just as a final, a few reservations on what you said. I'm not as revolutionary to imagine about a post-dollar economy, or probably, I don't know. But I'm just thinking about the methods of eliminating imbalances. What would be the methods of eliminating the imbalances given countries have very different productive capacities, very different levels of technologies, very different specialities in terms of natural resources, labor. Do you have a vision of how to eliminate these imbalances?
Okay. I begin with a premise. The premise is that people all over the world are sort of pretty intelligent and more or less equally intelligent and more or less equally capable of producing and so on. It's true that some may not have access to technology. Therefore, technological access should be made freer. A post-dollar economy is one in which I could expect that there would be freer movement of technology, freer movement of knowledge, freer movement of methods of production, but not freer movement of goods, because freer movement of goods would necessarily mean, freer movement of goods in a world in which demand is limited basically means that different countries are competing against one another for a limited demand. Therefore, in fact, free trade, it seems to me, is fundamentally opposed to a socialist vision of the world. Because the socialist vision, free trade as we visualize today, because free trade as we visualize today is not free trade associated with any effort at managing the level of world aggregate demand. We're not talking about that. Now that being, and one way of improving world aggregate demand is in the surplus countries learn to adjust their economy, because that's one way of enhancing demand. But as of now, we are not talking about that issue at all. In which case, to introduce free trade basically means that my exports outcompete yours within an overall size of the world market. And therefore, it is countries engaging against one another in a kind of competitive race instead of cooperation. You see, but standard trade theory, which actually says that free trade is good, visualizes free trade as entailing cooperation among countries. That, okay, England is good at producing something and Portugal is good at producing something, and therefore they exchange one another and the vector of world output increases.
So just to stay with this, I completely agree with your vision that we should eliminate imbalances because that is hindering aggregate demand, the global aggregate demand, and also national aggregate demand for the low productive economies. Where I have reservations is whether disrupting trade or even eliminating international trade is the only way to do that, or whether one can think about other capital account flows through international reserve of kind of aid system or the way we are thinking about carbon surpluses and carbon budgetings at a global scale. So address two of my questions. What's your vision of international trade? In your system, are we completely eliminating international trade, or would we have international trade to the extent where deficit countries export would cap that? Yeah.
Let us for a moment consider as if the world is one country. Okay. Now, in a one-country world, if you have sufficient aggregate demand, you would have full employment. But the point is, if you now don't have control over aggregate demand, as Keynes argued, then you have unemployment. Okay. Now, what is happening today is that we are talking about international trade in a world in which there is no control over aggregate demand. What I'm saying is that in a world in which there is no control over aggregate demand, having free trade is really a means of exporting unemployment from one country to another.
Right.
Okay. And that, I believe, is fundamentally inimical to national cooperation, international cooperation between nations. That's my argument.
So would you, what's your thoughts on some of the recent discussions about, let's say on India, there are discussions about imposing a tax on Chinese steel. And the business press is now reporting that there is a commission now being set up to review this, and apparently there is a negotiation between the small producers, small industrial producers who consume steel. They were initially apprehensive because their cost of production might go up, and now the big producers are saying that we would subsidize you. Would you then support that kind of arrangement?
I would support in principle such an arrangement if the losers from any such arrangement are adequately compensated. In other words, I don't want an arrangement where, as you said, the small producers are squeezed. But on the other hand, in principle, I am in favor of protection for enlarging employment. Now, the point is that in a country like India, let us say, simply enlarging aggregate demand through fiscal measures would not be enough because you leak out. Okay. So if you are going to have a fiscal stimulus for the economy, in that case, some degree of protection may become necessary. Okay. Now, to that extent, I would say that for me, employment is a primary objective. And that being the case, if employment is being thwarted, the employment objective is being thwarted because of free trade, I would be opposed to free trade.
Okay. I think this is a nice moment to widen the discussion, to understand your takes and thoughts about the post-Second World War Dirigiste regimes, compare how that compares to the neoliberal world order. And we can start with a global aggregate analysis, or what I was thinking is if we can start with global south and we can discuss more about India on that, and then we can discuss a little bit on China separately, because China was very different for the Maoist phase and the post-Maoist phase. And then we can circle back and discuss about the global north a little bit. So if we can start about your thoughts on how you see the late 1940s to the 1970s in terms of the global south, let's say India, and how that compares to the post-70s, post-90s world.
You see, firstly, if you take the world economy as a whole, there is absolutely no doubt that the growth rate of the world economy in that phase was much higher than it is in the later phase, almost double.
But that is shouldered mostly by the global north countries. The slowdown is mostly because the global north is slowing down.
No, I think if you take, let us say, from the end of the Second World War until late 60s, I think the rate of growth of the world economy, including particularly the global south, is higher than the rate of growth subsequently. It is true that some countries have done well in the later period. I'll come to that later. But if you take the world economy, exactly. And of course, in the global north, that is absolutely clear.
Absolutely true. Yes.
But the point is that that within it, because let's say India is a country which has done well in the latter phase in terms of GDP growth rate compared to earlier, many people argue that look, India really lost out. Some people say India's lost 4 decades and so on and so forth. I believe that is really completely false. It's false for 2 reasons. Firstly, that if you look at even the GDP growth rate, now a lot of people are saying that this later period GDP growth rate is highly overestimated. I mean, Arvind Subramanian says by about 2.5% per annum. I mean, he's talking on the post-2012 phase. But
and this was when he was with the government.
This was when he was with the government. And of course, he wrote about it after leaving the government. Yes, he wrote that Harvard working papers. And Ashok Modi and many others are saying this. And I think it's something which even I believe, the former chief statistician in the country, friend, agrees with. Okay, so in terms of growth rates, if you really take 2.5% out of the growth rate that is supposedly accelerated, then you don't have that much of a difference.
You may be at best similar, or maybe
Okay, maybe a little
0.5
bit more, yeah,
percent.
maybe a little bit more, but
With
not-
huge inequality.
That's right. And in addition, huge inequality, increase in inequalities. Therefore, really speaking, this latter phase being better than the earlier one is a very dubious proposition. You look at Piketty's figure. They say that actually the top 1%, you have a continuous decline in the share of the top 1% of the population in national income, right until 1982, where it falls from 12% to something to 6%. And then now it's gone up to 22.6%. So the point is that when you look at the my small acceleration in the GDP growth rate with enormous increase in inequalities, in that case, I think that proposition is no longer sustainable. But the second thing, which I think is very important, which never gets looked at, is the fact that, if you look at per capita food availability, let's take absolutely essential goods. Food is the most elemental necessity. Per capita food availability, food grain availability, which, as you know, in the last 50 years of British Raj has fallen dramatically in India from almost 200 kilograms at the beginning of the 20th century to almost 138 kilograms at the time of independence. It went up to about 185 kilograms just from the eve of the introduction of neoliberal policies. Then it fell, and it has now come up again to about 185. So the point is that, and during the latter period again, if you take inequalities having widened, the demand for food grains, this is gross demand, including for feed grains and including for processed food and so on and so forth. So if it is the case that the demand for feed grains and processed foods must have increased because of the rise in income inequalities, then the proportion of the population not having adequate food grains would have increased in the neoliberal period compared to what it was at the beginning of the neoliberal period. And I'm not saying compared to the average, because obviously it is very. And in fact, this is what you do find. You find that the proportion of the population which is below, let's say rural population, below 2,200 calories per person per day, it had more or less stabilized, having presumably increased from the time of independence. We don't have data going back all the way, but you have data from around 1973, until about 1993-4, it was more or less stable. At about 58% in 1993-4. It has gone up to 68% in 2011-12. And of course, it has climbed still further to an astronomical figure, almost over 80% by 2017-18, which was so astronomical that the Modi government decided to stop the NSS sample surveys in the farm altogether. So I think in terms of people becoming better off in terms of an elemental necessity, I think the period of neoliberalism has actually made things worse for us. And so nutritional poverty has actually increased in the neoliberal.
Yeah, and sometimes this is so counterintuitive for the generation from which we come from. I mean, when I was reading Professor Patnaik's paper, and some of which you have used the data, I was so surprised. I thought like the production has doubled since the 1990s. How can it fall? But then the enormous amount of population increase is so invisibilized. So if you divide that by the population increase from, let's say, 88 crore to like 140, you get that number. And yeah, so
and also exports. Sometimes we have been exporting food really.
Yes, there are some differences in net imports as well, but the data is very clear even by economic surveys.
Stocks as well, holding of stocks.
Right.
Because if you don't have enough purchasing power, then government holds stocks. We don't have data of private stock holding, but government stock holding especially is quite high, which is one reason why the Modi government can now give 5 kilograms of food grains per month to 80 crores of people. I mean, after all, it's not as if there's been a massive increase now, but they have sufficient stock.
We'll come back to some of the wider discussions about a non-GDP centered approach to economics. But if we can, before that, address a little bit about your thoughts on China. I was particularly thinking about it when you were discussing Germany and Greece. And I was thinking that there might be some similar relations, not in terms of the financial hegemony, but some similar relations in terms of full employment and labor relations between China and other global South countries. So I have two questions for you. A, in terms of China, how do you look at the Maoist period of China and its post-reform spectacular? Some people even calls it miracle. I'd be interested in your thoughts. And secondly, the relationship between China's enormous productive capacity and its impact on other global South countries.
You know, when it comes to the comparison between the Maoist period and the subsequent period, I would say that in the subsequent period, China has been remarkably successful as an exporter. But this has two very important consequences. One, of course, is that it makes China's continued success dependent upon its having an access to markets for its products. And we know that the United States is now coming down on Chinese goods. So China becomes vulnerable that way. But secondly, more importantly, building up an export surplus is against raising domestic consumption. In other words, the Chinese could have improved the condition of their people, which is the peasantry, instead of building this enormous export surplus and holding claims on the United States. Now, holding claims on the United States and building an export surplus may be good for power, but it's not good for the people. So I would be very critical of the recent Chinese success insofar as it does not translate itself to the extent it could in terms of a rise in the domestic consumption.
There is a lot of talks now about increasing domestic consumption. Some of it is because of the reasons you have discussed about the unfavorable external situation. I still want to ask you, how would you increase aggregate demand, let's say in 1970s China, without the export market, at a scale that China did, like 10% double-digit growth, like for 2 decades. I mean, I understand the argument at this moment because now they have had a massive population transfer from agriculture into industry, so there is some aggregate demand already there, which you can expand to some redistributive schemes. But how does India or other global South countries do that without leveraging the export market?
You know why exports are not needed? And in other words, you have a free health service. You have a free education. You have, an increasing employment, public employment firstly. You increase domestic purchasing power, that would create a demand for food grains. And if it creates demand for food grains, then your food grains output would rise and all the rest of it. So I don't think exports are essential at all for expanding the domestic absorption of goods, except to the extent that technology may not always be available. But on the other hand, the Chinese now are becoming technologically quite sophisticated. And one of the whole purposes of the Nehruvian period in India, by the Chinese really from independence right up to liberalization, is that we were actually trying to build up our own technology. So I think technological self-reliance had actually gone together with the Dirigiste. And I think that is the way for the global South to move.
Do you think to that extent the Soviet Union model had something to teach us, given it was not so much reliant on the export sector? The only addition I would like you to address here is that China or India were much more labor intensive to the extent like land per capita, resources per capita for Soviet Union was much better than what China and India was to that extent. But what's your thought on
No, I would say that the alternative to an export-led strategy would be an agriculture-led strategy. In other words, I think long ago, uh, uh, a very well-known Cambridge economist had drawn this distinction that exporting to other countries as a way of industrialization can be contrasted with industry exporting to agriculture as a way of industrialization. So I would say that really speaking, the alternative to export-led growth would be domestic market-led growth, but domestic market-led growth can occur only on the basis of an expanding agriculture. Okay. I think the Soviet Union's problem, of course, is that it never succeeded for historical reasons and so on.
And they also squeezed agriculture, by the way.
I know,
The
exactly,
scissors gap,
exactly, because it was the first country, and mind you, Bukharin's strategy during the great industrialization debate was actually to encourage agricultural growth, let the domestic market expand, and so on. But I think that is a strategy they did not follow. Instead, they followed the strategy of squeezing agriculture to build up industry. Uh, you know, it's difficult now in hindsight to actually see that given the fears they had of imperial encirclement and war and all the rest of it, what they should have done. And it's not an issue I really want to go into. Many people, people have gone into it. But certainly for countries like India and even China, I would say that really development, I mean, genuine development must occur on the basis of an expansion of the domestic market, which in turn requires an expansion of agriculture. An expansion of agriculture based not on the basis of capitalist agriculture, but a cooperativized agriculture.
This is very interesting. We had Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, your colleague, comrade, and we were discussing about his thoughts on industry and industrial policy, particularly vis-a-vis the problem of formalizing the economy, because the massive problem that global South countries face is the enormous presence and persistence, I would say, of the informal sector. And Professor Chandrasekhar claimed that it's hard for him to think about formalizing the economy rapidly without giving or increasing the share of the economy in industry. What you are saying, on the other hand, that might be a bit outdated, and we can think about agriculture itself as the main driver.
Well, I would say that no, I mean, of course, industrialization would be necessary. But the point is, I would say that industrialization based on an agricultural growth. If agriculture grows, in that case, not only does it supply goods for the industrial sector, including food, but what is more, it also generates demand for industrial goods. Now, I think this generating of demand for industrial goods from domestic agriculture is absolutely essential, because that then takes the place of having to export in the world market at the expense of other countries and keeping your wages down for that reason, etc. So I would really, when I say agriculture-led industrialization, I would not say agriculture supplants industry, but rather agriculture is the mechanism through which industrialization takes place. In fact, I would go even further. I would say that you mentioned shifting of labor force. I think shifting of labor force should be voluntary. Okay. That being the case, I would be in favor of breaking down the distinction between agriculture and industry. If you have, let's say, a cooperative, I've been arguing for a long time, the cooperative itself should set up industry. I think one of the problems that the Indian left faced, I think the reason why West Bengal, which is the base of the left, collapsed is because they actually tried to dispossess peasants in order to take over the land, to give it to the Tatars to set up a plant. I think if it is the case that there had been an agricultural cooperative that had actually set up the plant, and if necessary, even, and we are talking about an economy in which there is capitalism, even in collaboration with the Tatars, but not only the Tatars taking over from the peasants their land, but the cooperative reaching an agreement with the Tatars to set up a kind of car plant. That was very much better. I think we have to think in terms of breaking down the complete distinction between agriculture and
This reminds me of the TVEs in China, the towns and
that's
village
right,
enterprises,
exactly.
which is so
Exactly.
dynamic and linked sector. Um, uh, to shift a little bit of our conversation to wider discussion about our vision about economies, economic justice, or even the discipline of economics, I am quite convinced that we should move away from the very tunneled view of GDP-centered neoclassical or whatever approach to economics. One of the very important alternative parameter might be food, which you, Professor Patnaik, and others have worked and contributed a lot. I'm thinking what could be some of the other parameters in which we should focus on when we are thinking about development, economic justice, because one of the things that at least my generation and those of us particularly coming from the middle class face is that, in the neoliberal period, we have more electricity, we have better roads, we now have mobile phones and more consumer goods, and so it must be a better period, even if there is large inequality. Uh, can you share your thoughts on what can be some of the other parameters where we should focus on when we think about development or economic justice?
Two obvious ones that strike me are health and education. Health is pretty obvious. In fact, there has to be. I think on a priority basis, there has to be, through a national health service, free quality health care for all. I believe a society is something which, as long as it lacks that kind of a thing, is not a society which I would consider, no matter how high it GDP growth, a society as a success story. And the other is education. We talk about democracy, but on the other hand, democracy requires an educated population. Quite apart from the fact that education should be a right in itself, the word and so on. It's quite shocking that actually we still are so far lagging behind when it comes to education. As a matter of fact, you see, one of the reasons that the absence of public education is one reason why the rural people, the peasants, for instance, they get indebted. They want to send their children to schools, but now the schools charge fees, and much higher fees, and so they take debt, and they can't pay back the debt, and therefore many of them commit suicide. As a matter of fact, I was in Kerala at the planning board, and we wanted to bring in a bill against these peasant indexes, and setting up a debt relief commission that would actually get rid of the peasant indebtedness. One of the issues which was raised against that bill, we brought it in, of course, and we did set up a commission, was that, look, but these are debts which are taken for healthcare. These are debts to hospitals. They are not debts for agricultural purposes. But you see, the peasant's economy is a totality.
Right.
And that being the case, so education, healthcare, these are very absolutely essential. In fact, I would really say that far more important compared to GDP is ensuring that every citizen in the country has at least 5 fundamental economic rights. Like we have the right to freedom of religion, right to freedom of speech, and so on, we should actually have 5 fundamental economic rights. One is right to food. The second is right to employment, failing which the state should actually pay the full wage if the person doesn't get employment. The third is right to free quality healthcare through an NHS. The fourth is free quality education. And the fifth, of course, is old age pension, which is a kind of adequate livable pension and disability benefits, which we don't have in the country, non-contributory.
Right. I think I want you to discuss a little bit about the global north under neoliberalism to sum up this discussion. Also, given the very question about full employment, was this idea very prevalent in the global north that somehow the Keynesian consensus, post-war Keynesian consensus, was somewhat successful, even within people in the left, and there must be some attempt to go back to that. But from a global south perspective, you argue that, of course, it was possible. To some extent, it created its own inflation and stagflation eventually because wages were rising, but that also came at the cost of huge deflation imposed on the global south in terms of super exploitation. Can you tell us how you look at what happened to Europe and the US during the neoliberal period?
In the neoliberal period, not the earlier period.
I'm more interested in neoliberal period, but if you have to discuss...
No, you see, basically, it is quite remarkable that the opposition to Keynesianism came from the ranks of capital. Okay. I mean, Keynesianism was accepted by social democracy, but on the other hand, Keynesianism was opposed by the capitalists. I mean, I won't say all capital, but fundamentally the hegemonic section of capital, which is finance. So and I think the contradictions of the Keynesian regime in the post-war period, as you said, was because of the coming in of inflation. And that had basically two reasons. One is that the reserve army of labor cannot be allowed to dwindle without giving rise to wage increases. So capitalism requires a reserve army. Keynes didn't think so. Keynes thought money illusion, which in his view would mean that you can have full employment without the workers really protesting, demanding higher wages, is something that would be good enough, but it was not, and obviously capitalism cannot do without reserve army of labor. I'm not saying that the entire unemployment of the 1930s was reserve army of labor. No, of course. Of course, there's substantial unemployment arising because of demand shortage. But on the other hand, capitalism cannot do without reserve army of labor. And it is true that the rate of unemployment was really very low. When I went to England for my PhD, the unemployment rate in the British economy was 2%.
This was 1960s?
60, yeah, 6%. Similarly, in the US, it was about 4%. True that, you can say that not the estimate was underestimated, but it was really as close as you can get in a capitalist economy to full employment. The second thing that happened is that in the global south, all the raw material producers and so on really enlarged their output in order to earn greater foreign exchange. Okay. In fact, let's say India and Sri Lanka were competing in tea. And as a result, India and Sri Lanka both started pushing out tea exports and kept tea prices low. India and Bangladesh were pushing out, or those days East Pakistan were pushing out jute exports.
There's a good work by Manmohan Singh in 1961 about this vicious competitiveness in the export sector.
Exactly. So the point is, and that is something which actually enabled, if you like, Keynesian policies to be continued without facing a challenge of inflation from the primary commodities front. So from both fronts, it was facing challenges which had not yet appeared on the horizon. And they appeared on the horizon in the late 60s. First you had a worldwide wage explosion, and then you had the primary commodity price explosion. So Keynesianism in that sense really could not, I think Keynes's fundamental vision that you can stabilize the capitalist economy at a very high level of activity, which took neither imperialism into account nor the reserve army of labor into account, was flawed.
we are a left platform. We would appreciate if you can discuss a little bit about left politics. And the question I want to start with is, how do you look at the communist movement in India? And I'm thinking there have been criticisms about the communist movement from identity-based progressive politics, largely from the Dalit movement. But there is a recent article in Jacobin which says that in Kerala, some of the communist spokespersons or officials, they are falling to pressures from Hindu majoritarianism, where they are saying that districts like Malappuram is hotbed of crime because these are Muslims and they are in anti-national activities. But the communist movement has also been at the forefront of struggles for land, struggle for education, trade union movement. Can you give us a broad picture of, as a leading Marxist thinker, you have been grassroots activist as well, how do you look at the successes and failures of the communist movement in India?
Well, the communist movement has been remarkably strong, not in itself, but in influencing overall left positions. For instance, what we say are the kind of fundamental features of the Indian constitution, which are now being fought for the right to fight it: secularism, democracy, and so on, egalitarianism, etc., equality for law and all the rest of it. All of it came in the Karachi Congress Resolution of 1931. And the Karachi Congress Resolution was one which was very strongly supported by the left in Congress. And mind you, a lot of communists were in the Congress. My father, who was a communist activist and so on, was in the Congress. Similarly, Subhash Bose's election as president of the Congress was
In 1938.
Was made against Patabi Sitaram, was made possible because of the left, and the left included communists in Congress. So the communists' role has been really quite substantial, significant, not just in land struggles, but even in shaping the overall nature of the policies. But of course, this role now has really begun to dwindle significantly. I mean, even now they are, of course, on the right side and all that. That's not a surprise. The surprise is firstly, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That has hurt the communists greatly all over the world, including India. Secondly, I think neoliberalism. You see, neoliberalism has actually meant a globalization of finance. Capital has got globalized, but labor continues to be organized at a national level, because of which there is a fundamental weakness of the working class vis-a-vis globalized capital in each country. This weakness manifests itself in a weakness in the communist movement. And this weakness takes various forms. One is privatization of public sector enterprises. I mean, I remember when I returned from Oxford to JNU, railway strikes.
1974 railway strike.
Not even talking about 74.
It was 73 loco.
Yeah, exactly.
60th general.
Leading up to it, and loco and strike was fantastic. It was led by the communists. So you had these big public sector actions, and the working class was in the forefront of it. And the communists were, in many cases, leading it or certainly supporting it. But that era is gone. That era is gone not just because of Soviet Union, because of privatization and so on and so forth, and privatization, etc., become possible because of the weakening of the working class that can no longer put up a resistance against globalization. And then the third thing, of course, is, I think, an absence of innovative thinking on the part of the communists.
Please explain.
Yeah. You see, because till now, the communist agenda was fundamentally one which was set by Lenin. You see, Lenin had said that in countries where the bourgeoisie comes late to power, as a force and late to power, it lacks the capacity to carry through the democratic revolution. The core of the democratic revolution is the agrarian revolution, where the peasants have to be freed from the clutches of the landlords, of the feudal lords. And therefore, the agenda must be a worker peasant alliance in order to carry through land reform. That has been essentially the communist thinking right from now. In fact, this is what we are now seeing in India, some kind of a debate taking place, whether we should think further. Now, once you have land reforms, like in West Bengal, they had land reforms, then what do? Then, of course, you have to industrialize. But when you industrialize, what forms of industrialization are you talking about? You invite multinationals, you invite the big capitalists and so on, particularly in a setup like this, to set up industries, and if it is at the expense of the peasants, what do it? So I think there is a certain absence of innovative thinking which goes beyond Lenin and comes to terms with contemporary reality.
Would you think China did better there in the 80s? All those debates about reform and opening, its relationship with the business class and so on.
But as far as I'm concerned, China remains an open question. What is in China is building socialism. So China's economic success I'm not talking about. But China, to what extent it is moving to a socialist society, remains an open question. I think it remains an open question in the minds of the Chinese leaders themselves, who are all the time talking about, I mean, now they place a lot of emphasis on Marxist studies,
Right.
etc. Because they obviously feel that they have generated a middle class which is aspirational, which is quite successful. It's neoliberalism, or not neoliberalism. China is not exactly neoliberal, but opening up to the world has generated this very successful middle class. But it's not as interesting in Marxism, it's foreign revolution. So that remains an open question.
What do you see would be some of the political forms in which the left movements or people on grassroots can engage with? Because one of our problems, as far as I read it, is our politics is so much dominated by electoral politics. To what extent the left should engage in what ways, and to what are the alternative ways apart from electoral politics in terms of the real struggles for all the five things that you outlined to begin with?
But at the moment, I don't want to mince words. What we have is a neo-fascist regime. Okay. Therefore, if we have a neo-fascist regime, you have to have a coalition of all kinds of political forces in order to defeat the neo-fascist regime. I think the India bloc and so on has a sense in that, of which the left is very much a part. But the point is that if you are thinking of defeating neo-fascism and the electoralism, and then but then they come back like Trump has done. You see, because defeating neo-fascism must mean overcoming the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. That conjuncture is one of neoliberalism at a dead end. Okay. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that the left should actually strive for an economic agenda for the India bloc, for all these. Let it be a minimal agenda, not an agenda of socialism, but even that, in terms of providing authentic relief to people, not in terms of cash dole-outs and so on, but as I said, education, health, and employment, very important issue, employment. So some kind of an economic agenda involving these is absolutely essential. Therefore, it's not enough to have electoral politics, but you have to really go beyond neoliberalism.
My last question: a lot of people from our generation, the young generation, are very cynical about capitalism. This is more true in the global north, but this is also very true in the global south, and particularly when you go to the working class in the global south, they are very cynical about rise of global corporations and so on and so forth. And yet, I think this is also something that separates your generation from my generation, which is to think or imagine about a post-capitalist order. The excitement is missing because these grassroots movements that, what would you say as someone who has been, who has shared with us the optimism of Gramscian optimism of will and pessimism of intellect? What would you say to our generation who doesn't believe in the capitalist world to provide justice, but also is visionless to the extent of thinking about a larger vision?
I think there the collapse of the Soviet Union has played a major role because everything said and done. When I was a student, for instance, you thought of the Soviet Union, yes, imperfect society. I mean, they have party dictatorship and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, a society that introduces some degree of economic fairness. Okay, I mean, the most gigantic welfare state in the world. So I think the collapse of the Soviet Union really was a major factor behind this loss of hope that the younger generation has today.
Which I have always wondered, China has not been able to do that in terms of the other global.
I think for a while, Maoist China did it.
It did. It had a huge international impact.
But on the other hand,
But the post-reform
I
China.
mean, obviously nobody would like post-reform China to be a model because, I mean, it's a model. You may think of it in terms of emulating it for growth and this and that, but on the other hand, it's not an inspiring model of people's empowerment. Okay, so that has not happened. I mean, Cuba and some are very small and they really are not right. So that is certainly what you are saying is true. But I think that is why it's very important for us. I mean, the solution doesn't lie in waiting for a revolution in some country to happen.
Right.
I think we have to really think in terms of, as I said, innovatively building up visions within particular society. Let us say in Indian society, I mean, I would say that the introduction of the rights to employment would have a certain impact. I don't know, I imagine, because what is happening now is the government's giving doles. But doles are not a kind of solution to a right is very different. So I think we have to think in terms of in each particular country. And similarly, innovation not just in terms of rights and this and that, but also institutional innovation. If you, for instance, have a cooperativization in agriculture, or if you have cooperatives owning industries, okay, I mean, Amul was a classic example of it. So you just think in terms of really, building at a national level, building at a micro level, alternative visions and therefore alternative possibilities. That will still have a big impact. I mean, I find a lot of young people, for instance, getting involved in NGOs, civil society organizations. They have the idealism. In the old days, they would have been involved in left politics. But on the other hand, NGOs are very micro. So they're actually getting involved in micro level because they see some possibilities and alternative arising there. I think there has to be a marriage of left politics with that kind of a... Most of the NGOs, for instance, would not perhaps accept the concept of imperialism. They may not have even thought about it. But on the other hand, the left does. So it's very important to have a vision which is theoretically informed by the left, but on the other hand, which actually experiments at a local level with all kinds of innovations in institutions and also at a national level in terms of introducing rights, etc. So we just have to think in terms of an alternative located in our own country. We can't look to the Soviet Union, hope to replicate it in our country.
Lenin was asked prior to 1917 in 1916 about the revolution, and he said, I'm not sure when it will happen, probably not sooner because I am old, but this will happen and you guys should fight for it.
Yes.
Do you today think that socialism would come back?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in fact, It's absolutely inevitable because of the fact that I believe, like, like Rosa Luxemburg, the choices in barbarism and socialism. In fact, I would even be more specific that, that all over the world there is an emergence of the right of the left, of all kinds of fascism, neo-fascism, and so on. I think the struggle against this would carry us to socialism. So, so, I mean, I haven't lost my hope for a socialist future for mankind for a moment, because I think under capitalism it's not possible to have anything other than a fairly barbarous future.
On that note of optimism, we'll end it here, Professor Patnaik. That was such a pleasure and privilege to have you on. This was also, incidentally, our first in-person podcast. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.